Discord server. So these are all taken from people there. Thanks for submitting questions. From Hollywood. In terms of alignment, do you think it has any real utility for player characters at this point? Or just so you can tell if you're dealing with a demon in disguise and such? Any thoughts on the very early one-axis alignment that assumed a certain cosmology where law and chaos were at war and characters might be aligned with one side or the other, or neutral in the conflict?
I think this is an expansive topic. I think the alignment system, as presented in like D&D, the popularized alignment system from those days, I think can be a good utility for people that need a guideline to build a character around. For people like our performers, like we're used to stepping into roles and kind of creating in that space and letting the character's personality inform their decisions. But for some people, it's not a comfortable thing to do, and the alignment choice can help them become comfortable and where that character will go, as opposed to going, I just made this character, and then over time I think they're making good choices. Maybe they're a good person. People are like, I want to know if this is a good character because that will make me comfortable in making choices and making decisions as this personality.
Right.
I don't think it's necessary. I think it's a good training wheels type scenario when it comes to role playing, but once you have more experience, you're more interested in what the personality and the goals of your character are versus whether or not they're good, evil, neutral, and across the order and law spectrum.
I totally agree. And I think that weirdly, as someone who studied philosophy formally, 5e made a really strong move towards, I think, a more realistic depiction of human nature when it emphasized bonds, ideals, flaws.
Yes.
Again, not to be the expert on how human beings work, but generally speaking, it feels truer to me, the idea of like, oh, people do have like their bonds, their attachments to a group and to a community, or if not to a community, then to something else that's sort of tangible. They have their ideals, which might be organized along good or evil, or might not. I have a long-running campaign that is in a kind of colonial period where it's a lot of humans fighting other civilizations of humans, and detect evil and detect good become really hard because you're like, what does that mean in this context where there's not demons? And one of the things I ended up doing was we had detect evil become a cultural spell, so that we had one character from this culture called Yashad, where his detect evil is just detect cowardice. And it just means like, if you are physically, martially brave, you register to this guy as a good guy. And if you're not, you don't. So you could be the nicest, sweetest guy from this other little gnome culture or whatever, but if you get scared of physical confrontation, you're gonna register as evil to this guy.
That's interesting. Yeah, well, because when you break it down, there are universally good things that people can do, and there are universally evil things where most everyone agrees that's an evil person to do this.
Yeah.
You know, there's no one like, I don't know, Jeffrey Dahmer, he just misunderstood. Like, that guy was a fuckhead. But the 95% gradient in between those two is a lot of relative morality that you can't define on a universal scale. And so to that degree, I like adjustments like that, where you can customize aspects of it on a cultural level, on a perspective level. And yeah, I think it's an interesting tool on a basic scale, but as you become more of an advanced player and you want to pursue more delicious, detailed, and I don't know, philosophically fulfilling storytelling at the table, you really ask yourself what those mean or if they're even necessary.
I think that's very, very apt for almost any DM listening to this to like customize that again to your table. I would also say though that I think alignment's not going anywhere anytime soon. No. Partially because it is directly tied into the cosmology of the setting of D&D. If like, as long as there is Mount Celestia, Arborea, Beator, and the Abyss, you're going to have these four corner points of lawful good, lawful evil, chaotic evil, and like, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. Which I think is a kind of interesting, there's other ways around that, but I think that it's interesting that the utility of alignment in D&D is pretty equal to the utility of things like Myers-Briggs and other stuff in our world, where it's like, oh, this is one way of describing something that was kind of already there to begin with. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it makes more sense to be like, oh, this person has these tendencies towards order and goodness in that classic kind of paladin way. But that's just sort of a type of person to be, and this is describing that, rather than someone being like, I have dedicated myself to the ideals of lawful goodness, which is, it's like that's sort of a cart before the horse scenario. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think it's also why in the older editions, paladins were a very difficult class to really exemplify or play, because players would either have a hard time enjoying or fitting themselves into this preconceived notion of a lawful good paladin.
Yeah.
I can only do this much. My character can make choices in this box, and anything beyond that, I attack you. You know, that for a long time, that was kind of the perspective. And people either played paladins to be a dick to the rest of the players at the table and kind of fulfill a power fantasy of, ha-ha! You looked at me wrong. Stab.
Yeah.
You know, or they just didn't want to tackle it, and they were like, "That's too constraining. Like they're powerful, but I don't ever want to try and fit into this not realistic perception of a good character."
Right.
So yeah, it's not going anywhere, and it has utility. It has utility for setting. It has utility for being able to understand that in a game like Dungeons and Dragons or a lot of our role-playing games where you ultimately, part of the game is to overcome villains and rise up and become a hero. There has to be some level of universal antagonism.
Right.
And that's where the fiends come in. That's where part of that cosmology, there is a pure and defined entity force that is evil.
Yeah.
It may not be realistic to some stories out there, but that, I think, the alignment comes more into play in the outer planes type aspect of it. But when it comes to more personal stories in the world of humans and dwarves and tieflings all living together, mass hysteria type scenario, yeah, it gets a little more weird.
Yeah, I totally agree. That makes sense to me.